Matthew, thanks for joining us. If you could just sort of introduce yourself and your company,
Yeah,
that would be a good start.
So I'm Mapp. I've been at SWECO for 10 years. I have been in sustainability for the entirety of that time, working on a multitude of different buildings, main typology, sort of commercial, residential. We do a few kind of lab and our life sciences as well. I've been doing specifically whole life carbon for the last 7 years. So before it was kind of cool on the scene, if you will. And I have a deep interest and love of that side of things as well. So it's passion as well as job.
And what brought you into that whole life carbon sort of?
So I guess I did a kind of atmospheric and life science or earth sciences degree at university. During that period of time, we had a couple of lectures that were on kind of the built environment, and someone had said sort of 40% of emissions from the built environment. I thought, if I'm going to do anything for climate change, it's going to be that. Got into it at SWECO, did kind of a broad holistic sustainability, so BREEAM, bit of thermal modelling, bit of building modelling, and daylighting, sunlight analysis, those types of things. And then slowly but surely, I think it was about end of 2016, my director at the time had said to me this embodied carbon thing was coming. I had an interest in materials and how buildings came together anyway, so it was quite an easy flip into that. And then the quantification part I love, and then just started to pick up real speed over the last sort of 4 or 5 years in particular. It's been a crazy ride really in terms of how much has changed in that period.
Why facades particularly?
Facades for me, I mentioned this earlier, they are the boundary, one of the key boundaries between operational and embodied carbon. And you have to expend embodied carbon to generate a reduction in operational carbon. And therefore, if you're looking at a balance between two things, and how you achieve that balance is incredibly interesting to try and understand where the nuances are, what different types of facade systems can potentially benefit. Also looking at things like glazed to solid ratios and things like that, and how that not only impacts the operational emissions, but the embodied carbon you expend is significant on the facade.
And you've just given a very interesting talk. There were several moments when survey was mentioned, which to people like ourselves, absolute music to our ears. At what stage do you actually get involved in should people like ourselves get involved in the survey?
Well, as soon as the project starts, day one. All facades must be done, all surveys must be done day one. How else are you supposed to try and make the decisions that you need to make if you don't have the information on the table? It's very difficult because a lot of the time you're relying on things like having drawings from existing previous constructions and things like that. And what if the solid elements of the facade are 50, 60 years old? We did a building on Gracechurch Street where it was 1923. One slightly earlier on Portman Square. And where are you supposed to find the information? If you don't do the surveys and don't get that information, how are you supposed to baseline your performance and then understand how you're supposed to do better?
And from that survey, it's then the analysis of that information which brings you to your sort of decision-making process.
Exactly. So you can use that survey information to then model in something like IES virtual environment. You can model the facades, you can model the performance, and then you can get a baseline position, and then you can understand how changing things will potentially impact that overall performance. But for me, I think the other critical thing is that if you can also marry that survey with a materials quantification exercise, you can also then start to understand how much stuff do you have. So you're moving from operational now to embodied, and you're quantifying materials, and then you're saying, well, if we're going to take this glass out, how much of it is there? How are we going to take it out of the building? What is the process to doing that? How are we not just going to put it all in the skip, get it contaminated, and it can't be recycled? It just goes grade 2, cull it, and that's kind of enough. We need to look at how we're facilitating recycling materials, particularly within things like glass, to promote that, right?
Yeah, and that's potential recycling, but also potentially reuse.
Exactly. Yeah.
And of course, where glass is concerned, as you mentioned previously, you've worked on some pretty old buildings. The technology within the glass, the U values, the G values, they've improved and continue to improve.
Yeah.
And therefore you need to look at that. You also model that sort of thing.
Yeah, we definitely do. It's really important. And the problem has been that regulation-wise, there's not really any regulation in the UK for embodied carbon, right? So we'll leave that to one side for a minute. But regulation-wise, in terms of operational, you're looking at Part L and the way that's changed just from the kind of 2013 to 2021 version. There's so much emphasis now on fabric performance, almost to the point where it's being squeezed, where you can't deliver that with things like double glazing, right? You're almost forced into a situation with triple glazing, which seems like insanity because the amount of embodied carbon that you potentially be racking up as a result of that. But we are forced almost by those regulations to consider those things, but it's really getting to the point where you're narrowing what you can physically do, and as a result, you'll get potentially homogeny of buildings. As a result of that, there will be fewer things that you can do to meet those targets, and as a result, you won't be able to deliver some of the spaces that we've seen previously, which is that always such a bad thing? I'm not really sure that it is, because, reducing the amount of glazing has been, we don't see many glass boxes anymore. And that's been a nature of what we've seen of these downwards facing regulations.
And regulations, is that how things get changed in the construction industry? I mean, it's a general question.
I think so, yeah. It kind of carrot and stick maybe, but more of the stick than the carrot. But it kind of has to be, I think. And which is why we've seen in the body carbon side maybe slightly less or more reluctance to uptake. It's a lot of industry voices rather than you have to's. The GLA has helped out in London because they've got their policy which says you've got to quantify, you've got to at least meet the benchmark and then look towards achieving aspirational for embodied. But it's quite different in operational, but operational is much more mature, I would say. We've been doing Part L for a couple of decades now, and therefore there's a better understanding of how that comes together and what that means. But I don't think there's been a proper thought process of what that means for designing a facade, for example. And we're starting to see the impact of Part L 2021 now, where you're submitting planning applications which get nowhere near the 35% that's required in London. And part of that is you can only go so far with the facade before it becomes unworkable.
Have we reached the point where we've got the crossover between retrofit and new build? Do you think now we've, just in terms of sustainability and carbon embodiment and so on and so forth, have we reached the stage where we've got to really move across to retrofit versus new build?
I think so. I think a good analogy is kind of my portfolio of buildings that I've done, where I would say up until 5 years ago, 90% of the buildings I do were new builds. Now it's more like 60-40 in favour of retrofit in terms of the portfolio of buildings that I do. And there are things that have happened in the kind of microcosm of kind of whole life carbon and operational sustainability that have meant that's had to happen, like planning officers and committees have now become much more focused on this, the problem is now, retain now, and while I think that is right, I worry sometimes that focusing on the problems now is pushing the can down the road a little bit, and there will be a lot of people who disagree with me on that, because a lot of people think the problem is now. But as we get better and better at modelling and understanding the impacts of the future, some of the decisions you make now can really negatively impact your ability in the future, which is kind of what the graph was trying to say today, right? There's an uptick, and it's a dangerous place to be. Save now, save now, save now can sometimes, not always, but sometimes result in a worse overall position, and I worry about that.
Yes, I think from my perspective, and you showed it on your graph, but the whole life of the new glazing wasn't really taken into consideration, and the deterioration of that glazing over that 25-year period of time.
Yeah.
And there will, of course, be maintenance costs that aren't taken into consideration, and so on and so forth. So it's an interesting one.
Yeah, it is, and I think that the problem with those types of graphs, and I'm first to admit that it's imperfect, is that once you go down the road of the variables, sometimes there's so many variables you could do 250 of those graphs, and the client's like, which one's the right one to use?
Yeah.
And I think as long as we work together and make sure that we understand what those things are, how do you model degradation over time? Because when you're showing stuff like I was today, you're opening yourself up to criticism, and we've got to be transparent as possible and say, this is what we're showing, do you like it or do you not? Because that's how things change and get better. So until we get a good idea of what is the best model for degradation over time, how do you feed that in, all that stuff can be easily fed in to that story, and it makes an interesting read. It might even change the way it's perceived, which is, I find, endlessly interesting.
And sort of bringing this to a bit of a close, but in terms of retrofit versus new build, retrofit is a less costly, open question, but retrofit is a less costly exercise, or?
It should be, but it's not always. Simply for the fact that with a lot of these structures, there's a lot of push on to retain. Until you actually get in there and open it up, the risk is really significant of an adverse outcome. So while it is supposedly less time intensive in terms of a program, they usually rush through a retrofit much faster than you would over a longer period of time for a new build. But the risk is much more significant that you will have an adverse outcome, because how do you know until you get in there? If you've got a tenant, you haven't got VP on the building, then they won't let you in, they won't let you do the structural stuff, you can't do invasive surveys, and until you actually knock it out, and this is what my contractor contacts tell me all the time, is that until you get in, until you really take the bones out, you can have all the drawings in the world, but until you're on there, the risk remains.
Absolutely, yes, yeah. So, what, as a facade retrofitter, what should we be saying to building owners when we come to that survey, when we come to the what to do with their building moving forward?
I would go in with the operational energy and the neighbours part first, right? Mainly because you are dictational in that field. For them getting that right and actually hitting the performance, the dictational aspect of your part is, in my opinion, by far the most important of all. And it's not the client generally who's saying that, it will be their investors and their tenants. So they'll be squeezed from both directions. They'll both have ESG, CSR strategies, and they'll all want, forget the embody, put that to one side for a minute, they'll all want the best operationally performing building that is possible. And without the type of work that you do, I think it's very, very difficult to get to a position where you can categorically say that, and everyone wants a number. They want something to hang their hat on, right? Without the work that you do at the early stages with the surveying, etc., they can't get that. So you are giving them that peace of mind and that comfort to say, this is the direction of travel, and therefore these things are achievable. Because everyone likes to sing and dance at the start and say, oh, I've got a golden star and I'm doing this 5-star neighbours. If you can't actually prove it, and when it comes to the proof in the pudding, it's even more embarrassing to have to step back than it is to have done all the work at the start and be in a better position. So, yeah.
And of course they will have these targets,
All of them.
sitting in the background,
Yep.
needing them to take action, to make decisions.
So that's the hook in mind.
Yeah. Super. Lovely. Thank you, Matthew.
Perfect.
Much appreciated.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Much appreciated. And thank you.